You see, you're already healing faster.
This is real.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Dom Griffin. I'm a film critic and you're watching the Armchair Auteur, an ongoing video series where I talk about and review films. If you're into movie reviews and film and pop culture and things like that, please consider subscribing. Today we're going to be reviewing a film called The Old Guard, which debuted yesterday on Netflix. It's directed by Gina Prince-Bythewood, the director of Love and Basketball and one of my favorite movies, Beyond the Lights. This is her first real foray into like action adventure movies, and it's based on a comic book by Greg Rucka and Leandro Fernandez, which was published by Image a few years ago. And Rucka himself actually came on board as the screenwriter. So this is one of those rare instances where someone that writes a comic gets it made into a movie and gets to write it themselves. It's also one of those rare instances where the movie, even though it differs in many ways from the comic, is actually kind of on par, pretty close to the quality of its source material. This is not a movie that's like, you know, vastly diminishing returns. It's actually pretty good, and it matches up to what it's based on pretty well. The Old Guard is basically, without getting into too much plot detail, it's a very straightforward movie. It's about a group of immortals, the people who've been alive for hundreds to thousands of years, who try to use their extended time on Earth to do good. So it's been sort of incorrectly labeled as like a superhero movie because it's based on a comic, and these people have like powers, but their power is just that like they can't die and they're old. So it's not really like a superhero movie. No one has like code names and stuff like that. There's no like super villains or anything. In reality, it's much more kind of like a military style thriller where it's just people with guns fighting other groups of people with guns. If you're at all familiar with Greg Rucka as a comic book writer and a novelist, he's written tons of books set in like the espionage genre, and his shtick, as it were, when he writes comics is he tends to write very strong female characters who have some kind of combat experience and some different measure of self-loathing. And then like they fight people and things happen. Like it's, even when he was like writing Wonder Woman, that's kind of essentially like he's a guy that primarily sticks more to like gritty crime fiction, espionage, thriller type stuff. But he has written superhero books in the past as well, to varying degree. The Old Guard is one of his creator-owned series. Him and Leandro Fernandez, the artist, created and owned. Rucka and Fernandez are originally linked up on the comic Queen and Country, which is a really good spy comic from years ago, and it's very clear like they work really well together. If you read the book, it's fun. It has really good art, strong story, pretty good dialogue and stuff. It's very straightforward, but it is sort of one of these creator-owned books that Image has been publishing for the last like 5 or 6 years that seem exclusively designed to be turned into movies, if that makes sense. Like in the comics world, a lot of creators will become big names at like the big two with DC or Marvel writing corporate IP, and they'll get kind of fed up for like always having to fight like the machine, and they'll go make their own comics with an artist or someone else, you know, and the Image often is a publisher that will publish them. But so many of those guys sort of discovered that like every major like Image series the last several years has gotten bought and optioned as a movie or TV property. Not many of them have all come to fruition and actually been put out in the world, but like it's a surefire way to make money because of like The Walking Dead and like every Mark Miller. They always feel a little bit immediately watered down because they're being created with being optioned to a movie in mind. I'm not accusing Greg Rucka of doing that here. I think this was, you know, sometimes these guys do make comics for comics' sake. But if you've read The Old Guard, like from the minute you're a few pages in, you're like, oh, this could be a movie. This is like obviously going to be like a very cinematic comic book. The movie, as a result, doesn't have to do as much work to be translated to the screen. I think what's actually kind of fun about the movie is that Rucka wrote the first volume of the series, and then he, I think, got an option, was able to write the script for the movie, and I believe at the same time he started working on the second volume of the book, which is currently being published. And you can tell that some of the ideas he came up with in the adaptation or in the writing of the second volume kind of like mixed into the adaptation. So there are elements of the story that come from the new volume that's currently being published, and there are other elements that maybe came from the movie that ended up in the comic or vice versa. So it's difficult to say that like the source material is better or the movie is better because they each attack the story according to their respective mediums, which is very rare, I think, in modern adaptations. A lot of times, for instance, so in a comic, whatever you write or draw, someone can make, and it takes a lot of time and effort on the artist's part to bring it to life, but it doesn't cost like more. It just takes more time, so I guess in some way it does cost more. But if you're an artist and you have to draw like several buildings and spaceships and different stuff, it's not drastically different than having to draw like a bunch of people in a room or something. So, you know, comics as a result, tend to be more imaginative, because there's no like confines beyond what you can think of in your mind and what the artist is being properly paid and given time to render. So when you read The Old Guard, it is a much more action-oriented comic than it is as a movie, because the action in the comic is, you can just every few pages draw an action sequence to keep the book exciting. In a movie, you do have to slow down a little bit to have time for the characters to breathe or to explain things, so the audience can actually breathe between those moments. Both the comic and the movie focus primarily on two main characters. Andy, played by Charlize Theron, who's the oldest of the immortal characters. She's like 6,000 years old. And Kiki Lane from the film If Beale Street Could Talk plays Nile, who's like the newest recruit to this group. It's a very small group, and so she's the youngest because she's just the age she is, and then she discovers that she can't die. The comic treats the story as sort of this younger person showing this older person who's kind of given up on being as old as she is, like new life and understanding why she does what she does in this world. And the movie also does that, but it does it like much more economically and doesn't focus so much on the actual character interplay, because it's a movie and the audience, needs more time to like accept and understand the limits of this concept. They need time to look at these people and their powers and how it interacts with the world. They have all these questions, and Niall's sort of the audience character, so she has these questions too. And like, it's very much like there's a lot of exposition and stuff. There are other more spoilery things that are different from the comic and the movie that I don't really want to give away, because they're like essentially twists for parts of the story, and like they're much of the story, so I don't want to like ruin all that. But suffice to say, both the comic and the movie are essentially ruminations on death. Obviously, most stories about immortality are, but specifically about like the constraining time of life, and that like life doesn't have meaning unless it has like an ending, and like there's different ways you can interpret that, and some people interpret it to mean that everything happens for a reason, and that the things you do while you're alive really matter, and some people don't look at it that way, obviously. And in many ways, it sounds like this is a book that Greg Rucka wrote to work through the death of his father. So like that type of stuff is there, and it seems like that's something he didn't quite realize until he'd already put the comic out. So the movie has the benefit of his creative hindsight. Like, he put a comic out, people read it, there were reviews of it, he probably read some of the criticism, and the movie, as a result, is able to address some of the minor criticisms of the comic. There's little details and plot stuff. Events are rearranged in different ways that allow for there to be more room for breathing and certain stuff. The comic hits the ground running, immediately puts a bunch of the characters in danger, and then you have to kind of like pick up everything on the fly. This movie takes time to establish who they are before they ultimately are put into the big thrust of the plot, so you get more time with this group of mortal people together. And the movie's very well cast, so like the cast works really well together, and they have this amazing chemistry. You want to spend more time with them together. In the book, they're a little more fragmented, and you accept elements of their camaraderie based on like voiceover narration and flashbacks and stuff. The downside to this approach is that a lot of the changes, some of them that are like thematic or creative, are good, but many of the changes are just practical, and the reason for the practical changes is the same thing that's kind of wrong with the movie. It's important to point out that this is a Netflix original movie. This is a movie that Netflix has greenlit. And in many ways, The Old Guard is not a movie that a major studio necessarily make, because it's not really big enough to be a big, huge spectacle, but it's also not really small enough to be produced as like a small movie. Like, mid-range budgeted movies typically only exist on streaming platforms now. The downside of that is that the elements of the story that do feel bigger in scope are easier to produce in a comic book than they are in an actual movie. Example, each of these characters is like over 100 years old. They all come from different time periods. So the comic heavily shows tons of flashbacks, not actually fully fledged flashback scenes, but images of battles they've been in and like wars they've fought and like lives they've lived, with like narrative caption boxes, laid over the images. And that gives the story so much breadth. Like, it's not just that that these people are as old as they are, it's that you can see it. You see the many lives they've lived before ending up in this current, iteration where they're essentially like a Black Ops mission group. Like, they used to be like all these different things, And the movie can't really afford to do that. They cannot afford to set up a huge, extravagant, flashback sequence with a bunch of people dying by battle axes for like 2 minutes of screen time. They just can't really do it. So a lot of people's actual backstories are simplified in ways that can be more easily realized on a smaller scale. And it's cool. Like, a couple of the changes are actually pretty interesting. Like, one particular character relationship flashback is transferred from like the pirate era, like on a ship where like they would have had to have a humongous scene of people dying on a pirate ship, to being something that happens during the Salem witch trials. And it makes it a little more intimate, a little more like tragic. Once you see the story, you understand what I'm saying. But the original version like could not have been done. It would have been so expensive for one small moment of story. Now, doing this and scaling the story down and cutting out all the flashback stuff isn't bad per se. It forces the movie to rely very heavily on the actors to sell the fact that they're older than they really are. And all of the actors do a great job of that. It's a very, very good cast, and they work very well together. And, you know, in the movies they always say an actor can do something with a look that might take, 10 minutes of dialogue. You know what I mean? Like, so the movie does heavily rely on that. Gina Prince-Bythewood is a very strong director, and she knows how to, like, get really intimate, moments of inner turmoil with just shots and just the actors' performances, and it's great. It works great. But for a movie that's like a big action story that's sort of supposed to be starting a new franchise in some fashion, it does feel more hollow that you don't get to actually see what these characters have been through, and you have to imagine it yourself based on, like, suggestion. And normally, the movie could survive without all of the global, history stuff and just focus on the basic globetrotting espionage element of the way the story is told in the present day. But even that is kind of tampered down by the fact there's not a diversity of locations. Every scene kind of looks a little bit the same. And it's not like it's bad production design or bad cinematography or any of those things. Like, it's a pretty well-made movie. The action itself is smaller scale, but it's, very well framed, and it shows more long takes, and they don't rely too heavily on a lot of fast cross-cutting. But it still does feel like a much smaller movie than it did in comic form, even in, like, the story itself. Like, it feels smaller than it truly is. And the only explanation I can have for that is the way Netflix makes movies and the way they cut costs and the way they save money. At this point, the only directors who've made Netflix original movies that really feel like their movies is, like, Martin Scorsese and, like, Spike Lee, because they have very distinct visual styles. But everyone else, even someone like Michael Bay, who is extravagant, has a very recognizable style, the one movie he made for Netflix does feel kind of like a diet version of himself. So it's unfortunate that a lot of the criticisms I do have of the film and issues I have with it are more outside of the creative team's hands. It's just the nature of the movie studio that is making their movie and the money being spent and the confines they had to work within. It's why, a lot of these movies have this weird sort of, they almost feel like television. Like, at times the Old Guard feels like a really good pilot for a show that doesn't exist. Like, we're probably going to get a sequel maybe if this one streams well or the algorithm likes it, but it's sort of a shame. That said, I did really enjoy the movie. I thought it was really fun. I think a sequel would be good if they make one, if the whole team can come back. I think it's worth your time, especially since there's no other real big movies coming while we're stuck in quarantine still, and who knows when theaters are going to reopen. It's definitely worth your time to watch. It's just, it does sort of worry me if that is all what movies are going to be going forward, if every movie is going to have this feeling of being flattened and cheapened in some way. Like, sometimes you do have to spend the money to create visuals that feel alive and lively, and this doesn't quite do that. And I do think this is one of the movies where, like, if you watch it without the comic, it'll work, but if you have read the comic, it actually enhances looking at the movie. It doesn't make it, it's not like you have to read it to get it or anything, but it's fun seeing the different choices, because it's the same writer, and seeing how he tells essentially the same story, but slightly differently in different mediums. It's a really cool exercise if you want to understand screenwriting and adapting other material. But that's my take on The Old Guard. I think it's really fun. I think you should watch it. Of the things that came to streaming this last few weeks, it's pretty good. I think it's worthwhile. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you like this video, you should subscribe, because I make more videos and stuff that'll be coming out soon. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for supporting. Hope everyone's staying safe. Have a great day.